By the time my husband finally remembered he had a wife, he was already kissing another woman in front of paparazzi at JFK airport. The first photograph hit social media before his luggage reached the limousine. The second one reached my hospital room while I was trying to feed our newborn son. I stared at the screen for several seconds, not because I was surprised, because that single picture answered every question I had spent 7 years refusing to ask. Across the room, my baby stirred softly inside the bassinet. I looked at him, then quietly locked my phone. "Don't worry," I whispered. "He'll never get the chance to abandon you the way he abandoned me." The nurse thought I was talking about postpartum hormones. She had no idea I'd already made the biggest decision of my life. My husband believed he was returning home to end our marriage. He had no idea, by the time his plane landed, his company, his fortune, and even his family name had already begun slipping beyond his control. And the first person to betray him wouldn't be me. It would be someone he'd trusted his entire life. 2 weeks earlier, Julian Pierce stepped off his private jet wearing a linen shirt worth more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Sunlight still clung to his tanned skin. His smile looked effortless, relaxed, victorious. Beside him, Chloe Hart laughed as she slid her hand through his arm. "If every business trip looked like this, I'd never complain." Julian kissed the top of her head. "Then maybe I should travel more often." Camera shutters clicked somewhere across the terminal. Neither of them cared. They had stopped pretending months ago. Chloe adjusted her sunglasses. "You think anyone recognized us?" Julian smiled. "They'll recognize success." Not scandal. Success. That was always how Julian explained his life. Everything he wanted became justified the moment it increased his status. As they crossed the VIP terminal, his phone vibrated. Once, twice, again. He glanced down. 23 missed calls. His mother, the family office, his executive assistant, the hospital. He frowned, not out of concern, only curiosity. Chloe noticed. "Problem?" He checked the calendar for barely 2 seconds. "Oh." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "I think Eleanor had the baby." "You think?" "My mother's with her." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "They don't need me." Chloe watched him for a moment. Even she hadn't expected that answer. "You aren't going to call?" Julian shrugged. If something was wrong, someone would have kept calling. Marcus, his executive assistant, silently opened the rear door of the waiting Escalade. He had worked beside Julian for 11 years. He'd watched hostile takeovers, political investigations, and billion-dollar negotiations. Nothing had ever made him feel as uncomfortable as hearing a father describe his newborn child as someone else's responsibility. The SUV rolled toward Manhattan. Outside, New York moved exactly as it always had. Inside, silence settled over the cabin. Chloe was the first to break it. I posted one beach picture. Julian barely looked up. "So, people are commenting." She turned the phone toward him. One comment sat at the top. "Isn't his wife supposed to be giving birth today?" Another. "Congratulations on becoming a father." "I guess." Then another. "Wall Street's family man. Nice joke." Julian rolled his eyes. "Delete them. They're multiplying. So disable comments." She laughed. You really don't care what people think. Julian smiled without looking away from the city skyline. People forget scandals. They remember winners. Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure that was still true. 40 minutes later, the gates of the Pierce estate slowly opened. Margaret Pierce stood waiting inside the grand entrance hall, elegant, perfectly composed. She embraced her son as though he'd just returned from closing another successful acquisition. Welcome home. Thanks. How was St. Lucia? Incredible. Good. She adjusted the collar of his jacket. Only then did she mention Eleanor. She delivered a healthy boy. Julian nodded once. Everything okay? Yes. Another nod. Nice smile. No excitement. No request to see a photograph. Margaret studied him carefully. You aren't even going to ask his name? Julian looked almost confused. She already picked one. I'll learn it eventually. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she poured tea, waited, allowed the silence to stretch, then quietly placed a thick envelope beside his cup. Julian didn't need to open it. He recognized the law firm's seal immediately. The divorce papers? Margaret nodded. She refused. His eyes narrowed. Why? She said. Margaret chose her words carefully. She'll only sign if the papers come directly from you. Julian leaned back, still trying to negotiate. Margaret smiled faintly. She's emotional. Women often are after childbirth. Julian looked toward the window. I'll handle it. What about the baby? I'll bring him home. And Eleanor? He answered without hesitation. She'll receive whatever settlement her lawyers ask for. Margaret nodded slowly. Exactly the answer she had expected. Exactly the answer she needed. Because there was one thing Julian still didn't know. The divorce papers lying beside his hand weren't the same version Eleanor had received at the hospital. An hour later, Julian arrived at the exclusive maternity recovery center, room 308. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the room looked untouched. The bed had already been remade. Fresh flowers were gone. Closets stood empty. Even the framed birth announcement had disappeared. It felt less like someone had checked out and more like someone had erased every trace of ever existing. A nurse entered carrying folded towels. She stopped when she saw him. Mr. Pierce? Where's my wife? Confusion crossed her face. You don't know? Julian's expression hardened. Know what? Mrs. Pierce left 12 days ago. His heartbeat slowed. Not faster. Slower. Who picked her up? The nurse hesitated. A security team. Whose? I wasn't told. My son? She frowned gently. She left with her baby. Julian corrected her automatically. My son. The nurse didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her pocket. She asked me to give you this. A plain white envelope. No address, no return name. Only 6 handwritten words across the front. You were never the real target. Julian frowned. What does that mean? I don't know, the nurse answered honestly. She said, You'd understand after watching the video. Inside the envelope, there were no divorce papers, only a small black flash drive. Julian turned it over in his hand. Marcus looked at him. "Sir, should we see what's on it?" Julian stared at the drive for several long seconds, then slipped it into his pocket. "It can wait." He walked toward the elevator, certain, absolutely certain, that Eleanor was simply trying one final emotional trick. Behind him, the nurse watched the elevator doors close. She whispered so quietly that neither man heard her. "I hope you're wrong." Because she'd seen Eleanor's face the night she recorded that message. It wasn't the face of a woman begging her husband to come back. It was the face of someone saying goodbye, after discovering a truth she could never unknow. Julian didn't watch the flash drive, not in the hospital, not in the car, not even after returning to Pierce Capital. He tossed the envelope onto the corner of his desk beside a stack of acquisition reports. "If she wanted to say something," he muttered, "she should have answered her phone." Marcus glanced at the envelope. "Sir, maybe it's important." Julian didn't even look up. "Everything becomes important after a breakup." "This will be no different." He walked into the executive boardroom. 24 directors were already waiting. Projected behind them, Pierce Capital, Strategic Growth Initiative. To Julian, this meeting mattered. His marriage didn't. His son didn't. His wife disappearing with a private security team barely registered as an inconvenience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he smiled, "let's make history." 3 hours later, history was exactly what they made. The board unanimously approved the largest expansion in Pierce Capital's history, nearly $600 million. Applause filled the room. The chairman extended his hand. "Congratulations." Julian accepted it confidently. "Thank you. You've built one of Wall Street's great success stories." Julian smiled. "I've had good people around me." Across the room, Marcus quietly lowered his eyes, because he knew that wasn't entirely true. The best person Julian had ever had just walked away, and he hadn't even noticed. As the meeting ended, the chief financial officer approached. "We've got a small problem." Julian barely listened. "What kind?" "The Montgomery Group." Julian stopped walking. "What about them?" "They've frozen several investment vehicles." "So?" "They're connected to our fundraising round." Julian frowned. "Who authorized that?" "No one. The freeze came directly from Montgomery Legal." Julian laughed once. "Call them." "We did." "And?" "They refused to discuss it." "For what reason?" The CFO hesitated. "They said, Mrs. Eleanor Pierce requested an immediate review." Julian's smile disappeared. 30 minutes later, his office door burst open. Chloe walked inside carrying her tablet. "You've seen the market?" "No." "Pierce Capital is trending." She turned the screen toward him. Every business site carried the same photograph. Him, stepping off the private jet, Chloe wrapped around his arm. Below it, another picture. Eleanor, still wearing a hospital gown, holding their newborn, alone. The headlines spread across every financial publication. Wall Street CEO returns from luxury vacation 14 days after wife gives birth, alone. Comments flooded beneath it. "He chose champagne over his son. So much for family values. Investors trust this man?" Julian tossed the tablet onto the desk. "It'll disappear in 48 hours. Chloe wasn't so sure. It already reached CNBC. He shrugged. They'll move on. But they didn't. Not this time. That evening, Julian finally drove to the townhouse. For the first time, he noticed the silence. No music, no lights, no scent of Eleanor's coffee drifting through the kitchen. The house didn't feel empty. It felt abandoned. He climbed the staircase. The nursery door stood open. Inside, every piece of furniture remained. The crib, the rocking chair, the shelves, everything, except the baby. Even the framed ultrasound photo was gone. Someone had deliberately removed every memory that belonged to a family. His phone rang. "Margaret. Did you find her?" "No. I told you she'd calm down." Julian walked slowly through the nursery. "She took everything personal." "Good," Margaret answered immediately. "What?" "It makes the divorce easier." Julian looked at the empty crib. For reasons he couldn't explain, that sentence bothered him. Only a little, but enough to linger. The following morning, Marcus entered, carrying a black folder. "You have visitors." "I don't." "They didn't ask." Marcus handed him a business card. "Daniel Montgomery, Chief Investment Officer, Montgomery Group." Julian's jaw tightened. So, she finally sent her family. Daniel was already waiting inside the conference room. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't smile. He simply placed a leather folder on the table. "I'm here representing my sister." Julian laughed. "She's hiding behind billionaires now?" Daniel calmly met his eyes. "No. She's standing behind people who actually showed up." Silence. Julian opened the folder. His expression hardened. Every investment account connected to Eleanor had been frozen. Every trust, every jointly held entity, every authorization. Until further notice. "This is ridiculous." "No," Daniel answered. "It's precaution. You can't freeze my company because my wife is emotional." Daniel's eyes never left Julian. "This has nothing to do with emotion. It has everything to do with your signatures." Julian frowned. "My signatures?" Daniel slid another document across the table. "I suggest you read page 7. Julian did. Halfway down the page, one sentence made his stomach tighten. Potential personal liability attached to executive approvals. He looked back up. "What is this?" "That's exactly what we're trying to find out." Julian stood. "This is your family's revenge." Daniel almost smiled. "If Eleanor wanted revenge, you wouldn't be sitting in this office. You'd already be answering questions from federal investigators." Julian's confidence flickered. Only for a second. Then it returned. "This is bluffing." "Is it?" Daniel reached into his briefcase, pulled out another envelope. This one looked familiar. The same cream-colored stationery, the same law firm seal. Julian frowned. "What is that?" "The version of the divorce agreement your wife actually received." Julian opened it. His eyes moved across the pages, then stopped. Slowly, he looked toward Daniel. "This isn't the agreement my mother showed me." "No," Daniel replied quietly. It isn't. There are 3 additional clauses. There are. Who changed them? Daniel held his gaze. That's the first question you should have asked. Julian stared at the documents. For the first time since stepping off the plane, a thought entered his mind that refused to leave. What if he wasn't the one controlling the game? That night, long after everyone had left, Julian finally remembered the flash drive. He plugged it into his laptop. A single video file appeared. No title, no timestamp. Only Eleanor's face filled the screen. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She looked strangely peaceful. Julian, if you're watching this, then something happened exactly the way I feared. She paused. I know you think this divorce is about your affair. It isn't. Another pause. It's about the day I discovered someone inside Pierce Capital had been preparing for my disappearance months before I ever knew my marriage was over. Julian froze. Then Eleanor said 7 words that made every hair on his arm stand up. The first person you should stop trusting is your mother. The video cut to black. Julian watched the video again, then a 3rd time. Each replay made less sense than the one before. His mother? Margaret Pierce had spent 30 years protecting him. She built the family's reputation. She introduced him to investors. She stood beside him when Pierce Capital had been nothing more than 12 desks inside a rented office. The idea was absurd. Until he remembered something. The divorce agreement. There had been 2 different versions. He had seen one. Eleanor had received another. Someone had changed the documents. And no one had told him. For the first time in years, certainty slipped through his fingers. The next morning, Julian arrived at Pierce Capital before sunrise. Marcus was already waiting. You've never been here this early. Julian ignored the comment. I need every revision of the divorce agreement. Marcus looked surprised. The legal department? Every draft. And don't tell anyone. Marcus nodded. Including your mother? Julian hesitated. Just long enough for Marcus to notice. Especially my mother. 45 minutes later, the folders covered Julian's conference table. Draft 1, Draft 2, Draft 3, Final. At first glance, they looked identical. Then Marcus quietly slid another document beside them. I highlighted every revision. Julian began reading. Page after page, clause after clause. Nothing unusual. Until page 9. His eyes stopped. 3 investment entities connected to Eleanor's personal trust had quietly been transferred into a liability structure attached to Pierce Capital. Julian frowned. I never approved this. Marcus looked at him carefully. Your digital signature says you did. Julian turned the page. The approval date hit him immediately. He wasn't in New York. He'd been speaking at the Davos Financial Forum in Switzerland. There was no way he could have signed anything inside headquarters. Pull the access logs. Marcus didn't move. They're already here. Julian looked up. You expected this? I've expected something. For a very long time. Marcus placed another folder on the table. Security records. Biometric access. Document history. Every approval carried Julian's executive credentials. But something didn't fit. Every file had been opened after midnight. Julian never worked after midnight. Everyone inside Pierce Capital knew that. He stared at Marcus. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus answered honestly. "Because every time I tried to warn you, you told me your mother had already reviewed everything." Silence. A heavy one. "You stopped listening years ago, Julian." The words weren't cruel. That made them worse. Across town, Eleanor stood inside the Montgomery estate overlooking Manhattan. Her father entered quietly. William Montgomery hadn't asked about Julian once. Instead, he handed Eleanor a thin folder. "Our investigators finished the background review." "So soon?" William smiled faintly. "I started 2 weeks before you called." She looked up. "You knew?" "I knew something was wrong." "How?" He sat across from her. "You stopped laughing." Eleanor looked down at the folder. Inside, there weren't financial statements. There were photographs. Julian. Margaret. Outside counsel. 3 meetings, 6 months apart. None appeared on Pierce Capital's official calendar. One photograph showed Margaret handing a sealed envelope to the firm's external attorney. Another showed the same attorney meeting privately with the company's chief financial officer. The final photograph bothered Eleanor most. Margaret wasn't speaking. She was listening to someone sitting inside the back seat of a black sedan. The window reflected too much sunlight to identify the passenger. Only one detail remained visible: a signet ring, dark gold, with a lion engraved into the face. William tapped the picture. "Our people couldn't identify him. But whoever he is, your mother-in-law answers to him." Eleanor frowned. "I thought Margaret was running everything." William slowly shook his head. "So did I." Meanwhile, Julian was making the same discovery. He stormed into the legal department without warning. General Counsel Robert Lang nearly dropped his coffee. "Julian? Who changed my divorce agreement?" Robert blinked. "I assumed you authorized it." "I didn't." Silence. Robert slowly walked toward a locked filing cabinet. "There may be something you should see." He removed an internal authorization form. Signed, stamped, approved. Everything appeared legitimate, until Robert pointed toward the bottom. "Notice the approval code." Julian leaned closer. The code didn't belong to him. It belonged to Margaret Pierce. Julian looked up. "My mother can't authorize executive legal changes." Robert hesitated. "She normally can't." "Then why was she able to?" "Because..." Robert swallowed. 3 years ago, you quietly expanded her authority." "I don't remember doing that," Robert answered softly. "I know." Julian left the office without another word. His phone rang. Margaret. He let it ring. Again. Ignored. Again. Ignored. 5 calls. 6. 7. Finally, a message arrived. "Where are you?" Another. "We need to talk before the board does." Julian stared at those last 4 words. Before the board. Not before the lawyers. Not before Eleanor. The board. How did she know the board was about to become involved? He hadn't told anyone. Not Marcus, not legal, not even Daniel. Someone else had. Or someone inside the company was reporting directly to her. That afternoon, the Emergency Executive Committee convened. Julian walked into the room expecting routine discussions. Instead, every director already had a black folder waiting in front of them. The chairman looked unusually serious. "We've received an anonymous whistleblower package." Julian's heartbeat slowed. Anonymous? The chairman continued. "It alleges unauthorized alterations to executive legal documents and possible misuse of corporate governance authority." Every head turned toward Julian. The chairman looked directly at him. "As CEO, can you explain why your executive authority appears on documents you now claim you never approved?" Julian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because for the first time, he genuinely didn't know whether he was the victim or merely the man who had made the crime possible. Then the conference room doors opened. A woman in a dark navy suit stepped inside. No introduction, no hesitation. She placed a leather credential wallet on the chairman's desk. "My name is Victoria Hale, independent forensic auditor. I was hired 3 weeks ago, under a confidential instruction." The chairman frowned. "By whom?" Victoria slowly turned her head. Her eyes settled, not on Julian, but on Margaret Pierce, who had just quietly entered through the rear door. And then Victoria said the one sentence that caused every conversation in the room to die instantly. "I'm here because Mrs. Pierce asked me to investigate her own son." No one in the boardroom spoke. Not even Margaret. She stood perfectly still near the entrance, one hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. Julian looked from Victoria to his mother, then back again. "You hired her?" Margaret answered calmly. "Yes." Julian almost laughed. "To investigate me?" "No." She met his eyes without blinking. "I hired her to investigate whoever was using your name." The room shifted, only slightly, but it shifted. For the first time, Julian wasn't sure whether his mother had just protected him or cornered him. Victoria Hale opened a slim leather portfolio. "I believe some context is necessary." She pressed a remote. A timeline appeared across the screen. 28 months, hundreds of transactions, legal amendments, board approvals, trust restructures. Nothing looked dramatic until the red circles appeared. Every suspicious transaction had one thing in common. They were all approved within 48 hours of Julian leaving New York. Business trips, economic summits, investor conferences, never while he was home. Victoria looked toward Julian. "Where were you on March 17th? "London." "April 22nd? "Singapore." "July 9th? "Davos." She nodded. Exactly. Every date matched another unauthorized approval. Julian slowly looked around the room. "If I wasn't here, who was?" No one answered, because that question terrified everyone. The chairman folded his hands. "So you're saying someone deliberately waited until the CEO left the country?" Victoria nodded. "That's our current conclusion." One director frowned. "Who had access?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. "Very few." She pressed another button. 4 names appeared. Julian Pierce, Margaret Pierce, General Counsel Robert Lang, Chief Financial Officer Samuel Grant. Silence. Julian immediately looked toward Grant. The CFO looked genuinely confused. "I've never approved anything outside accounting." Robert spoke next. "Neither have I." Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Margaret. She didn't flinch. "I expected that," she said quietly. Julian stared at her. "Then explain." "I will." Margaret removed a sealed envelope from her handbag. "I hired Victoria 6 weeks ago because someone attempted to access the Pierce family trust." Julian frowned. "What trust?" "The trust your grandfather created. You told me it was dissolved." "I lied." Another silence, longer this time. "I lied because your grandfather made one condition. If I ever believed you had become incapable of protecting the family's legacy, control would pass to another trustee." Julian's voice hardened. "You've been hiding this from me for years." "Yes." "Why?" "Because success changed you." The words hit harder than any accusation. "You stopped questioning people," Margaret continued. "You signed whatever your assistants placed in front of you. You trusted titles instead of facts. You stopped reading." Julian clenched his jaw. "So this is my fault?" "No," Margaret answered immediately. "But your arrogance created the opportunity." Before Julian could respond, Victoria interrupted. "Mrs. Pierce is telling the truth." Every head turned. "The trust exists, and someone has been trying to gain control of it." Julian frowned. "My divorce?" Victoria nodded. "Was never just about your marriage." Another click. The screen changed. Now everyone saw the hidden clause Eleanor had discovered, the one transferring liability. But beside it, another clause appeared, one that had never reached Eleanor. "Emergency Trustee Replacement Authorization." The chairman slowly read it aloud. "If both spouses sign, control of the Pierce family trust automatically transfers to the designated emergency trustee." Julian stared. "I've never seen this." "You weren't supposed to," Victoria replied. Grant suddenly stood. "This is insane." "We're talking about a family trust." "What does that have to do with Pierce Capital?" Victoria looked directly at him. "Everything." She pressed another button. A web of companies filled the screen. Pierce Capital, consulting firms, holding companies, private trusts. Everything connected. One director whispered, "My God." Victoria nodded. "The trust secretly guarantees nearly 40% of Pierce Capital's institutional credit." The room exploded. If control changed, our lenders could recall everything. The company would collapse. Who would benefit? Questions flew from every direction. Victoria raised one hand. "Exactly. That's the real investigation." Julian slowly turned toward his mother. "You really thought someone was trying to destroy the company?" Margaret looked exhausted for the first time in years. "I knew someone was." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I tried." "When?" She smiled sadly. "The first night you skipped dinner with Eleanor." "You answered 3 phone calls while I was speaking." "The second time, you left my birthday to fly to Zurich." "The third, you told me I worried too much." Julian looked away. He remembered none of those conversations. Not because they hadn't happened, because he'd stopped listening to everyone who loved him. Just then, Marcus entered the boardroom without knocking. He almost never interrupted meetings. Never. "I'm sorry, but this couldn't wait." He handed Victoria a tablet. She read the message. Her expression changed instantly. "What happened?" the chairman asked. Victoria looked up slowly. "The person behind the shell companies just emptied every corporate account we were monitoring." Grant's face turned white. "That's impossible." "It happened 8 minutes ago." Julian stood. "How much?" Victoria didn't answer. She simply turned the tablet around. The number covered the entire screen. $412 million. Every dollar gone. And then Marcus quietly said something that made Julian's blood run cold. "The transfer authorization was approved using your live executive credentials." Julian stared at him. "I've been in this room for 2 hours. Marcus nodded. "I know." Victoria slowly closed the tablet, which means whoever we're looking for is inside this building. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. $412 million. Gone. Not frozen, not delayed. Transferred. Julian looked directly at Marcus. "Lock every exit." Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "Done. No one leaves this building." Within seconds, security alerts echoed through Pierce Capital. "Elevator access disabled. Parking garage sealed. Executive elevators locked." Employees poured out of conference rooms, confused by the sudden announcement. No one knew why, only that something catastrophic had happened. Victoria turned toward the chairman. "We're assuming the attacker is still connected to the network." Grant immediately protested. "How? If they already have the money, why stay?" Victoria didn't answer. Instead, she opened the transaction log. Every transfer had originated from the CEO's executive token. Not copied, not forged, the actual encrypted authentication key. Julian frowned. "That's impossible. My authentication token never leaves me." Victoria looked at him. "Where is it now?" Julian instinctively reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Empty. He checked the other side. Nothing. His briefcase. Nothing. His face changed. Marcus noticed immediately. "It's gone," Julian whispered. Marcus replayed the previous 24 hours in his head. The hospital, the townhouse, the boardroom, the legal office. Every stop, every handshake, every elevator. Someone had taken it. Not hacked it. Taken it. Victoria spoke quietly. This wasn't a cyber attack. It was physical. Someone needed access to your executive token and your biometric approval sequence. Julian looked up sharply. "My fingerprint." Victoria nodded. "Which means someone got close enough to you to collect both." Across the table, Samuel Grant suddenly stood. "This is ridiculous. We're wasting time." "We need to notify federal authorities." No one answered, because Marcus was staring at Grant. "What?" Grant snapped. Marcus frowned. "When did you leave yesterday afternoon?" Grant looked confused. "I had lunch." "With who?" "My wife." Marcus didn't blink. No. You canceled lunch. I remember because I rearranged your calendar. Grant hesitated. It became a client meeting. Which client? Another pause. No answer. Julian slowly turned. Answer him. Grant swallowed. I signed an NDA. Marcus quietly placed a printed visitor log onto the table. No, Sam. You never checked out. You never left the building. Silence. Grant's forehead glistened. For the first time, he looked nervous. Victoria slid a photograph across the table. Security footage. Timestamp. Yesterday. 2:14 p.m. Grant walking into the executive archive. Alone. Julian frowned. Why were you there? Grant looked at the image. Another photograph. 2:27 p.m. Grant leaving, carrying a black document case. One that didn't belong to him. Another image. 2:31 p.m. The same case disappearing into the private records vault. Julian's voice became dangerously calm. What was inside? Grant's breathing quickened. I don't know. Marcus stepped forward. You checked out the CEO authentication backup file. Grant's eyes widened. I was instructed to. By who? Grant looked toward the door, not toward Julian, not toward Victoria, toward Margaret. Everyone noticed. Margaret didn't move. Grant closed his eyes. I can't. Julian slammed both hands onto the table. You'd better start talking. Grant slowly opened his eyes. You think this started 6 months ago. He laughed bitterly. It didn't. It started 15 years ago. The room fell silent again. Grant looked directly at Julian. You were never supposed to become CEO. Julian stared. What? The board chose someone else. No, Margaret interrupted. That's enough. Grant shook his head. No. I've kept your secret for 15 years. I'm done. He looked back at Julian. The board wanted Daniel Montgomery. Julian froze. Victoria looked up sharply. Even she hadn't expected that. Grant continued. Your grandfather believed Daniel had the discipline, and Eleanor had the judgment. But Margaret refused. She convinced everyone that family blood mattered more. Julian slowly turned toward his mother. Tell me he's lying. Margaret said nothing. That silence was answer enough. The chairman stood. Margaret, is this true? She closed her eyes for only a second. When Arthur Pierce died, he believed Julian wasn't ready. Julian felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. My grandfather didn't choose me? Margaret finally looked at her son. No. I did. You fought the board? Yes. You manipulated the succession? Yes. You lied to me for 15 years? Another quiet answer. Yes. Julian staggered backward until he hit the conference table. Everything he believed about himself had been built on a lie. His success, his title, his legacy, none of it had truly been his. Before anyone could speak again, Marcus's phone rang. He answered. His face lost all color. What happened? Julian asked. Marcus lowered the phone slowly. Our internal surveillance server has just been erased. Victoria frowned. Completely? Marcus nodded. Every camera. Every backup. Every archive. Grant smiled. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him. You still don't understand. Victoria turned toward him. What don't we understand? Grant leaned back in his chair. You've been looking for one person. He laughed softly. There isn't one. What do you mean? Grant looked around the room, then calmly spoke the sentence that shattered every theory they had built over the last 2 days. Everything you've uncovered was designed by 5 people. He looked directly at Julian, and one of them is already sitting in this room. The conference room doors slowly opened. Everyone turned. No one expected the person who walked inside. Daniel Montgomery. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 federal agents carrying official credentials. Daniel looked at Julian, then at Margaret, before quietly saying, I wish we'd been wrong. One of the agents stepped forward, opened a sealed warrant, and read the first line aloud. We are executing a federal warrant regarding a conspiracy involving fraud, obstruction, and corporate racketeering. He stopped, looked directly at Margaret Pierce, and finished the sentence. With evidence identifying Mrs. Margaret Pierce as the primary suspect. The room exploded. No, Julian whispered. His eyes never left his mother. Margaret Pierce. The woman who had taught him how to negotiate, how to read people, how to survive Wall Street, was now standing in front of 2 federal agents. One of them unfolded the arrest warrant. Mrs. Margaret Pierce, you are being detained, pending investigation into conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, document falsification, and corporate racketeering. No one breathed, not even Margaret. She simply looked at the warrant, then calmly folded her hands. I assume Daniel finally found the ledger. Daniel answered quietly. We found much more than that. Julian stepped between the agents and his mother. There has to be a mistake. Victoria looked at him with genuine sympathy. I wish there were. She opened another file. It wasn't your authentication token they wanted. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even Pierce Capital. Julian frowned. What are you talking about? Victoria laid a faded photograph on the conference table. It showed 3 people. Arthur Pierce, a younger Margaret, and another man whose face had been scratched out. The company was never the objective. She tapped the scratched-out figure. This man was. Daniel continued. His name was Richard Hale. Julian looked toward Victoria. She slowly nodded. My father. The room became perfectly silent. He co-founded Pierce Capital with Arthur Pierce. Victoria's voice remained steady, despite the emotion beneath it. But 6 months before the IPO, he disappeared. Julian stared. My grandfather told everyone he retired. Victoria shook her head. He never retired. He vanished. Margaret finally spoke. I warned Arthur not to do it. Daniel turned sharply. So you admit you knew? I knew enough. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the old photograph. Arthur believed Richard was going to expose illegal offshore financing before the company went public. He panicked. Julian felt his stomach tighten. My grandfather? Framed his own partner? Margaret closed her eyes. He believed he was protecting thousands of employees. Victoria answered coldly. No. He protected his fortune. Julian looked around the room. Everything he believed about Pierce Capital collapsed in seconds. The company wasn't built on brilliant investments. It had been built on a buried crime. A crime that everyone afterward had spent decades protecting, including Margaret. Daniel placed another document onto the table. The shell companies weren't created to steal money. They were created to trace it. Julian looked confused. The 412 million? It never disappeared. Victoria smiled faintly. It moved. Where? Into a federal escrow account. Julian blinked. What? The money was never stolen. It was preserved as evidence. Samuel Grant slowly lowered his head. So, this entire transfer? Victoria nodded. Was a trap. Grant laughed bitterly. I knew something felt wrong. Daniel looked at him. It was. You just never realized. You were the bait. Federal agents immediately stepped beside Grant. One agent opened a folder. We have your recorded communications with the shell corporations. Grant's face lost every trace of confidence. You've been recording me? For 9 months, another agent added. The only reason you weren't arrested earlier was because we needed to know who gave the orders. Grant slowly turned, not toward Julian, toward Margaret. His lips trembled. You promised none of this would reach me. Margaret looked at him sadly. I promised I'd try. Grant collapsed into his chair. Without another word, he extended both wrists toward the agents. Julian stared at his mother. You used him. Yes. You used me. A pause. Yes. You used Eleanor. Margaret's composure finally cracked. I was trying to protect this family. Julian's voice rose for the first time in years. You weren't protecting us. You were protecting a lie. No one interrupted. Because everyone knew he was finally telling the truth. Margaret looked at her son with tears gathering in her eyes. I watched your grandfather destroy one man, and I convinced myself hiding it would save everyone else. She smiled weakly. Every year I told myself, just one more year. But lies don't stay buried. They grow. And eventually, they bury everyone standing on top of them. She turned toward the federal agents. I'm ready. They placed handcuffs around her wrists. The metallic click echoed across the boardroom. Julian couldn't remember ever hearing a louder sound. 3 months later, Pierce Capital looked very different. The criminal investigation continued. Several executives resigned. Others were indicted. The company survived, but barely. The board unanimously voted to separate the Pierce Family Trust from corporate governance forever. When they offered Julian the CEO position again, he declined. I'm not the man this company needs. For the first time in his life, he meant it. Daniel accepted the role of interim CEO until independent elections could be held. No one objected. Not even the shareholders. Julian sold the Manhattan penthouse, the sports cars, the yacht, Everything that had once convinced him he was successful. Then, on a quiet autumn afternoon, he drove alone to a small house overlooking the Hudson River. No cameras, no security, no reporters. Just one white porch swing moving gently in the wind. Eleanor opened the door before he knocked. Their son, Ethan, was taking his first unsteady steps across the living room. Julian froze. He had imagined this moment 100 times. None of those versions hurt this much. Ethan looked up, curious, smiling at a stranger. Julian realized something that no courtroom, no federal investigation, no billion-dollar laws had ever been able to teach him. A child doesn't remember the promises you make. He remembers the moments you missed. Julian's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." Eleanor quietly nodded. "I know. I'm asking if one day he can know who I became. Not who I was." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Eleanor stepped aside. "That's not my decision." She looked toward the little boy. "It'll be his." Julian slowly walked inside. Not as a CEO, not as a Pierce, not as the man who once believed winning justified everything. Just a father, hoping he hadn't arrived too late. 6 months later, the federal government released its final report. Arthur Pierce's role in the original conspiracy became public. Richard Hale's name was officially cleared after 28 years. Victoria visited her father's grave, carrying nothing more than the report. She placed it against the headstone. "We finally brought you home." People still argue about what happened to Margaret Pierce. Some say she was a criminal who deserved every year of her sentence. Others believe she spent decades sacrificing herself to hold together a family that had already been broken before her son was born. Maybe both are true. Because evil rarely begins with monsters. Sometimes, it begins with one frightened person telling themselves that one more lie is for the greater good. And by the time the truth finally arrives, the people you're trying to protect have become the people you've hurt the most.